Apologize to my mother right now, or you and Sophie can find somewhere else to sleep tonight. My husband's voice cut through the dining room, flat and cold, like he was reading it off a script he'd been rehearsing for years. I felt something inside me go very quiet and very still. He never expected me to actually consider the second option. It was Thanksgiving weekend, the Saturday before, when his entire family crowded into his parents' house in Oakville for the early dinner his mother insisted on hosting every year. I was 36. My name is Allison, and I had been married to Gregory for 8 years. We had a 4-year-old daughter, Sophie, who was upstairs napping when the whole evening came apart. Gregory wasn't cruel. I want to be fair about that, because it would be easy to make him into a villain, and he wasn't. Not really. He coached Sophie's swim lessons on Saturday mornings. He remembered our anniversary. He worked long hours at the firm and came home tired, but he still asked about my day. The problem was never Gregory on his own. The problem was Gregory, the moment his mother walked into a room. Linda had opinions about my cooking, about the school we'd chosen for Sophie, about the fact that I went back to work part-time as a dental hygienist 18 months after Sophie was born instead of staying home like she had. She had a way of delivering these opinions wrapped in concern, so that if you pushed back, you were the unreasonable one, the ungrateful one, the one causing problems at a family gathering. For years, I told myself it didn't matter. My own mom used to say, "Pick your battles," and I picked none of them. I smiled through comments about my parenting, agreed when I didn't agree, apologized when I hadn't done anything wrong, because keeping the peace felt like my job in that family, the unpaid position nobody else wanted. That Saturday, Linda had made her usual turkey, and the house smelled like sage and the cold front that had rolled in off the lake that week. Sophie was at the table picking at her plate, more interested in the dinner rolls than the vegetables, the way every 4-year-old on the planet is. Linda noticed, the way she always noticed, everything about how I was raising my own child. "She's not eating her vegetables again," Linda said. Not really to me, more to the table, in general, the way she liked to make her observations into group events. "She'll eat when she's hungry," I said. "Her pediatrician isn't worried about it." Linda made a small sound in her throat, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "Pediatricians say a lot of things. In my day, we didn't need a doctor to tell us how to feed a child." A few cousins chuckled. Gregory's younger sister, Whitney, who had flown in from Calgary for the weekend and always seemed to time her comments for maximum audience, leaned in. "Honestly, Allison, you read one parenting blog and suddenly you're an expert." My face went hot. I'd heard some version of this line so many times over the years that I could have mouthed it along with her. Normally, I would have laughed it off, made some self-deprecating joke, changed the subject before it became a thing. But something in me had run out of road that night. Maybe it was the 4th Thanksgiving in a row with the same script. Maybe it was the fact that Sophie was sitting right there, watching how her mother got treated, learning what was apparently expected of her one day. "I don't think trusting a doctor's advice is something to be mocked," I said, and I kept my voice level, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than if I'd shouted. The table went quiet for half a second. Then Linda's chin came up. "There she goes." "There I go what?" "Being difficult. You always do this." I felt that word, difficult, land somewhere behind my ribs. I'd been called difficult for refusing to let Whitney pierce Sophie's ears without asking me first. I'd been called difficult for wanting Christmas split evenly between both families instead of always defaulting to Oakville. I'd been called difficult for crying once, exactly once, after Linda told me in front of guests that I'd let myself go since the pregnancy. I looked at Gregory. I always looked at Gregory in these moments, hoping that this would be the time he finally said something. Anything. "Mom, that's enough. Allison's right. Even just, let's change the subject." He was sitting there with his fork halfway to his mouth, eyes down on his plate, doing what he always did, which was disappear into the furniture until it blew over. So I kept going. Quietly, calmly, I told them how exhausting it was, to be the permanent target at every family event, how tired I was of being corrected at my own daughter's dinner table, how I had spent 8 years trying to make myself smaller so that everyone else could feel comfortable. I wasn't yelling. I want to be clear about that, because afterward they all told the story like I had been screaming. Like I had thrown something. I hadn't. I was just, for the first time in years, not backing down. That was when Gregory finally spoke. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the hardwood. "Allison, that's enough. Apologize to my mother." I looked at him for a long moment, the kitchen clock ticking behind us. Somewhere upstairs, the baby monitor crackled faintly with the sound of Sophie shifting in her sleep. "No," I said. His jaw tightened. I had never told him no in front of his family before. I'm not sure I'd told him no in front of anyone before. He looked cornered, embarrassed, the way a man looks when his whole identity is suddenly on display and he doesn't like what people are seeing. "Apologize to my mother right now, or you and Sophie can find somewhere else to sleep tonight." I want to tell you I had some dramatic, cinematic reaction. I didn't. I just stood up, walked upstairs, gathered Sophie's overnight bag and her stuffed rabbit, carried my sleeping daughter down the stairs, past a room full of people who had finally stopped talking, and drove us to my sister's apartment in Mississauga without saying another word to anyone. I didn't cry until Sophie was asleep on my sister Renee's pull-out couch. Then I sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me and let myself feel, for the first time in a long time, how tired I actually was. Not angry, exactly. Tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone. And somewhere around midnight, staring at the ceiling, I remembered a conversation from 2 years earlier. A friend from dental hygiene school, Priya, had moved to Vancouver and eventually to a clinic outside Halifax. And the last time we'd caught up over video call, she'd mentioned, almost in passing, that her practice was looking for another hygienist and that the cost of living out east was a fraction of what we paid in the GTA. At the time, I'd laughed it off. Move across the country? With Gregory's whole life rooted in Oakville? It wasn't a real option. It had just been one of those conversations you have and then forget. I didn't forget it that night. At 1 in the morning, I messaged Priya. I told her I was thinking about a change and asked, almost as a joke to myself, if the position was still open. She wrote back the next morning. Not only was it still open, the clinic had just lost another hygienist to maternity leave, and they needed someone by January. She said she could put in a word that day if I was serious. I sat with that message for 2 full days before I answered. The thing people don't understand about a decision like this is that it isn't one decision. It's 100 small ones, stacked up quietly, one on top of the other, until the structure of your old life is gone, and you didn't even notice the moment it disappeared. I called a family lawyer my coworker had used during her own separation, a woman named Mrs. Faraday with an office above a bakery in Port Credit, and I sat across from her desk and asked, plainly, what my rights were. I needed to know, before I did anything else, exactly what I was and wasn't allowed to do. She was patient with me. She explained that under Ontario's Children's Law Reform Act, a parent cannot simply relocate a child to another province without either the other parent's written consent or a court order, even within Canada, even between provinces. I remember sitting there feeling almost relieved because it meant there was a right way to do this, a way that would hold up, a way nobody could later twist into something it wasn't. So that became the plan. Not a disappearance. A documented, lawful, unhurried exit. For the next several weeks, I behaved exactly the way I always had. I drove Sophie to daycare. I went to work. I made dinner most nights, though Gregory and I barely spoke beyond logistics. He texted twice that first week, short and clipped. We should talk. Mom feels really bad about how things got blown out of proportion. That last one almost made me laugh out loud in the staff room at the clinic, not because it was funny, because in 8 years, I had never once heard that anyone felt bad about how I was treated, only about how the story made the family look. Linda called my cell 4 times in 5 days. Whitney sent a long text about family loyalty that I read once and never answered. Nobody asked how I was doing. Nobody asked how Sophie was doing. They wanted the discomfort to end, not the cause of it. I went back to Mrs. Faraday twice more. We drew up a formal separation agreement, the kind that spells out parenting time, the kind that would be enforceable if Gregory ever changed his mind about being reasonable. I told him about the Halifax job in writing, by email, with the offer letter attached, so there would never be any question later about transparency. I proposed a parenting schedule that gave him generous time with Sophie during school breaks, flights paid for, video calls every other night. I wasn't trying to erase him from her life. I was trying to get both of us, all three of us, somewhere healthier than that dining room in Oakville. Gregory's first reaction, when the email landed, was disbelief. Then anger. He called Miss Faraday's office threatening to fight the relocation, and for about 2 weeks it looked like it might actually go to a hearing. I won't pretend that wasn't terrifying. I lay awake more than one night, running worst-case scenarios, picturing a judge siding with him, picturing Sophie's whole life, staying tangled up in that dining room forever. What changed his mind, in the end, wasn't me. It was his own father, oddly enough. Walter, Gregory's dad, a quiet man who rarely said much at those family dinners either, apparently sat his son down one evening and told him, in his own blunt way, that he'd watched Linda run roughshod over every woman who'd married into that family for 30 years, and that if Gregory let his marriage become collateral damage in his mother's need to always be right, he'd regret it for the rest of his life. I only heard about this conversation secondhand, months later, but I think about it often. Sometimes the people who finally see clearly are the ones who've been quietly watching the longest. Gregory withdrew his objection in March. We finalized the agreement. He would have Sophie for 2 full weeks at Christmas, 2 weeks in summer, March break, and as many video calls as he wanted in between. It wasn't the family I had pictured when I married him in a backyard in Burlington 8 years earlier. But it was honest, and it was ours, drawn up in black and white, instead of decided by whoever was loudest at a holiday dinner. The move itself happened on a gray Tuesday at the end of April. I'd sold most of our furniture, kept what mattered, and Sophie and I flew out of Pearson with 4 suitcases and her stuffed rabbit, the same one she'd had clutched against her chest the night we left Oakville. I remember looking out the window as the plane lifted over the lake, the whole shoreline of the city I'd spent my entire adult life in shrinking down to a smudge of gray and silver, and feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in years. The first months in Nova Scotia were not some instant fairy tale. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories that pretend it's all sunshine, the moment you're brave, do a disservice to anyone actually living through something hard. There were nights Sophie cried for her old room, for her dad, for the swing set at her grandparents' house, and I held her and cried right along with her, because some of it I missed too, even the imperfect parts. Starting a job at a new clinic in your late 30s is humbling. I didn't know anyone. I learned to parallel park on streets steeper than anything in the GTA. I learned what a nor'easter actually feels like. But Sophie started kindergarten that September in a school 3 blocks from our new apartment, a tiny brick building near the harbor, and within a month, she had a best friend named Quinn and was coming home asking if we could get a dog. She slept better. She laughed more. This easy, unguarded laugh I hadn't realized had gone quiet over the years until I heard it come back, and so did I. Gregory and I talk now most weeks, mostly about Sophie, sometimes about other things. He flew out for her first dance recital in November, stayed at a hotel near the waterfront, and afterward, we got coffee together, while Sophie napped at my place with the babysitter, and for the first time in a long while we talked like 2 people instead of 2 sides of an argument. He told me somewhat quietly that the distance had forced him to actually look at his family, instead of just absorbing whatever they said as fact. He said he'd started seeing a counselor, something I never imagined Gregory doing in the 8 years I knew him. He apologized, not for that one dinner, but for years of choosing his mother's comfort over my dignity, which is a much harder thing to say out loud and a much more important one. Linda has not apologized. I don't expect her to. Whitney sent one stiff, careful message last spring that I think was meant to be an olive branch, something about missing Sophie. I wrote back politely and left it there. Some bridges you rebuild. Some you simply stop walking across, and that's all right too. People sometimes ask me if I regret how far I went, taking Sophie across the entire country instead of just finding an apartment 10 minutes from Gregory's and calling it done. And the truth is, I didn't need distance from Gregory. I needed distance from the version of myself that thought she had to earn her place at every table by staying small. I needed enough physical space between Sophie and that dining room that she would never grow up. Thinking this was simply what marriage looked like, what family looked like, what a woman was supposed to absorb without complaint. The night Gregory told me to apologize or get out, he thought he was handing me an ultimatum he already knew the answer to. He thought I would do what I had always done, fold myself smaller, smile, say sorry for something I hadn't done, and let the evening end the way it always ended. He never imagined I would actually choose the door. But I did, and on the other side of it was an entire life I hadn't let myself want yet, in a small house near a harbor, with a daughter who laughs loudly now, and a respect, finally, that nobody handed me. I built it myself, one quiet decision at a time.